A late February evening at Lang Vei Base seemed unusually calm. In 1968, during the Vietnam War, calm usually meant only one thing: the enemy was preparing to strike. For weeks, intelligence reports had warned of a massive North Vietnamese buildup. Yet the base commander was unconcerned. Lang Vei was well fortified, with defenses strong enough to withstand hostile attacks. What the base commander didn't know was that this time the North Vietnamese were bringing something new to the battlefield, something they had never used before in the war. Lang Vei was a special forces outpost standing in the northwest corner of the Quang Tri province, only a short distance from the Laotian border and about 8 kilometers southwest of the Khe Sanh Marine Combat Base. The camp was built on Highway 9, the backbone of the northern First Corps area. Located just below the demilitarized zone, the base served as both a shield against infiltration from Laos and the DMZ and as a potential staging point for quick access to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Beyond overseeing this vital communication line, Lang Vei was also a center for training and deploying civilian irregular defense group CIDG units. These were locally recruited Vietnamese and Montagnards who patrolled the border, blocked enemy infiltration, and supported pacification efforts. The base was held by Detachment A-101 from Company C 5th Special Forces Group, headquartered at Da Nang. The detachment had moved to Lang Vei in 1966 from Khe Sanh to make way for the Marines. The first base they built near the village of Lang Vei was poorly placed and was destroyed by the North Vietnamese Army attack on May 4, 1967. In response, the new detachment commander, Captain Frank C. Willoughby, decided to build a new base about 1 kilometer to the west, directly overlooking Highway 9. The new base followed the fighting camp design. Its dog-bone-shaped perimeter was ringed by 3 belts of barbed wire, each 50 meters wide and laced with claymore mines. The defenses combined strong bunkers, trenches, and mutually supporting positions. The defenses were manned by 4 CIDG companies and 3 reconnaissance platoons, supported by a 14-man Vietnamese Special Forces contingent and interpreters, and 27 advisors from the Green Berets. In total, the base housed 700 men. The force was sufficient for routine duties, monitoring movements along the Zipone River and Ho Chi Minh Trail across the border in Laos. However, it was inadequate to withstand a large NVA assault. Namely, although the inner positions used by the Americans were hardened with thick concrete and strong bunkers built by the Navy Seabees, the outer lines manned by the Civilian Irregular Defense Group were little more than sandbag trenches with poor overhead cover. This imbalance left the camp vulnerable if the enemy brought attack weapons, and by early 1968, all signs suggested that such an attack was imminent. In early 1968, North Vietnamese forces intensified pressure along Highway 9 and around Khe Sanh. Patrols in Laos reported enemy activity on a scale far greater than before. More alarming still were reports of armor. Civilians claimed to have heard the clatter of tank tracks, and some patrols even found track marks on the ground. Interestingly, the brass decided to dismiss these warnings. They reasoned that the NVA could not possibly bring tanks into the jungle, and besides, the enemy had never used them in combat. But the reality was different. Not only that the NVA gathered troops of 4 battalions in size, they did bring tanks. Just across the border, the entire 24th Regiment of the 304th Division was preparing to attack American bases along Highway 9. For the task, the regiment was reinforced by the 2nd Battalion of the 325th Division, the 2nd Artillery Battalion of the 675th Regiment, 2 sapper companies, 1 anti-aircraft gun company, and a platoon of flamethrowers. But the most striking addition was the 2 tank companies from the 198th Tank Battalion, the 203rd Armored Regiment. These consisted of 14 Soviet PT-76 amphibious light tanks. Though weaker than the American M48 Patton, The PT-76 was highly mobile and could easily cross rivers, making it well suited for the terrain of the Central Highlands. American troops defending the area were unpleasantly surprised when on January 21st, the NVA attacked Khe Sanh village. Even though the Marine artillery prevented the fall of the base, it became apparent that the North Vietnamese were coming. Another warning followed on January 26th when large NVA forces attacked the 33rd Royal Laotian Elephant Battalion near the town of Chepon. The Laotian troops were beaten to the ground and were forced to retreat to South Vietnam. They were followed by thousands of refugees who clogged Highway 9. Both soldiers and their families found shelter at the old Lang Vei Base near the village. When special forces arrived to provide aid, the Laotians confirmed the rumors. Tanks had been used in the attack on Chepon. Laotian soldiers saw them with their own eyes. Their attacks were backed by a forward air controller who reported seeing 5 enemy tanks leaving the battlefield, one of which he destroyed with an airstrike. Captain Frank Willoughby, commanding the Lang Vei Base, had all the reasons to worry now that he knew the tanks were in play. His defenses, built for infantry assaults, were not prepared for armored vehicles, yet he took no new precautions, as if unwilling to believe the NVA would target them. Even the eruption of the Tet Offensive across South Vietnam at the end of January failed to shake higher headquarters at Da Nang. The alert level at Lang Vei remained the same. It was so strange. The North Vietnamese began to harass the base with artillery and mortar fire, but soldiers inside treated it as yet another daily routine. So negligent were the defenders of Lang Vei that on January 30th, an armed North Vietnamese deserter walked through the camp's main gates past 2 Bru guards who were asleep. He entered the team's house and surrendered, revealing that NVA officers and sappers had already scouted the base days earlier. Even this direct warning failed to rouse stronger defenses. Watches continued as before, with only half the men alert at night. It was as if the defenders had left the gate open for the invaders. Then came February 6th, the day of the first battle in which the North Vietnamese attacked with tanks. The night was heavy, with fog covering the entire area around Lang Vei. Just before midnight, a sudden burst of flares lit the sky. North Vietnamese sappers, moving through darkness, accidentally triggered them. The white light revealed 2 PT-76 tanks advancing from the southeast, followed by 2 battalions of infantry. More sappers trailed behind, joined by a heavy machine gun company and a platoon armed with flamethrowers. At the same time, another PT-76 company struck the Mobile Strike Force observation post 800 meters outside the wire. 2 tanks and an infantry company overran the position, while 6 more tanks cut off the roads leading to the camp to block any escape or reinforcement. If Lang Vei defenders had some suspicions earlier, now there was no doubt. The base was under a full-scale attack. Inside the wire, the defenders were stunned by the appearance of tanks in their base. Yet they responded by firing illumination from mortars to reveal the attackers. Along the outer trenches, CIDG and Mobile Strike Force troops triggered claymore mines and fired small arms, light machine guns, and grenades as the attackers closed in. Another group of soldiers manned 50 caliber machine guns and 106mm recoilless rifles and opened fire on the tanks. The 2 lead tanks that pressed into the perimeter were both hit by a recoilless rifle crew. One tank was destroyed, the other disabled. Special Forces soldiers then jumped in with small tank killer teams, firing M72 Laws at close range. Unfortunately, many of them failed to bring any damage to the tanks because M72 Laws had a built-in safety that required the rocket to travel at least 10 meters before arming. Unhindered, tanks rolled over the sandbag CIDG bunkers, crushing them, and then turned their guns on the ammunition and fuel dumps inside the perimeter. The fight turned to chaos. Explosions lit the camp while heavy weapon pits were destroyed one by one. Contact with the observation post was lost, and survivors scrambled for cover. Americans and indigenous troops pulled back toward the inner wire. Some crawled under buildings, while others crowded around the reinforced operations bunker. An AC-47 spooky gunship circling overhead sprayed fire from its minigun to help the defenders fight off the invaders. But it was not much of a help. Within 90 minutes, the camp was overwhelmed. The only position still holding was the concrete operations bunker where a group of Green Berets and Vietnamese soldiers sheltered. A PT-76 drove up the bunker's dirt berm and sat on its roof. Its weight shook the structure but failed to break through. The bunker's thick concrete walls were the only thing that kept the North Vietnamese from breaking in. They smashed antennas and cut power cables, leaving the defenders in total darkness. For the soldiers trapped inside, the next couple of hours became the most harrowing of their lives. With the entire base overpowered, the North Vietnamese focused on breaking into the bunker. Sappers placed shaped charges against the concrete walls, trying to make a hole in it. Although the walls resisted, the explosions sent shrapnel all over the bunker interior. When breaking through the walls failed, the North Vietnamese began to drop frag and concussion grenades and tear gas canisters down the air shafts. Flamethrowers burned through steel doors, raising the heat inside and sending fire and smoke through the vents. Still, the defenders, trapped in the dark, held on. They endured hour after hour of pounding. They knew help from the Marines at Quai Son, only 5 miles away, would not come. Moving at night through artillery and mortar fire was considered too dangerous, and daylight approaches were covered so heavily by artillery that an air-mobile assault was judged impossible. The men inside could do nothing but listen as sappers continued their work outside. At one point, the noise stopped. However, men inside knew this didn't mean the enemy retreated, but only took cover from what was coming. A massive charge detonated at the main entrance. The blast blew a hole 4 feet high and 8 feet wide, tearing into the earth and concrete. Half of the gap lay below the floor level, but the bunker held. But inside the bunker, shock threw men against walls and left some dazed. When brute force failed, the North Vietnamese tried persuasion. Through the smoke came a voice. An English-speaking North Vietnamese soldier called the soldiers out, urging them to surrender while promising mercy. He was answered with gunfire and curses. More tear gas was then pushed into the vents. The inside of the bunker was filled with gas, making breathing very painful. At this point, 4 South Vietnamese Special Forces soldiers decided to give up. They stepped out of the steel door and were taken away. A minute later, gunshots were heard, and although no one learned what happened to these soldiers, they were never seen again. After that, attempts to break in slowed. At that point, at Old Lang Vei, Sergeant First Class Eugene Ashley Jr. realized that he was the only hope for the Americans trapped in the operations bunker. With only about 15 Laotian volunteers, he launched several repeated attempts to break in. Coordinating closely with Marine artillery and forward air controllers, he led 5 separate assaults to push back the enemy and create an escape corridor. Unfortunately, during the 5th attack, Sergeant Ashley Jr. was mortally wounded. Yet his actions opened the way for the survivors. If it wasn't for his bravery, the Green Berets inside the bunker probably wouldn't have survived. After the war, Sergeant Ashley was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Inside the bunker, Captain Frank Willoughby, Lieutenant Paul Longrear, Staff Sergeants Arthur Brooks and Emmanuel Phillips, Sergeants John Early and Nicholas Fragos, and Specialists Franklin Dooms and James Moreland prepared to move. The deal was to break out and run toward the safety of Old Lang Vei. They weren't to stop even if someone got hit. As Green Berets rushed out of the bunker, Navy A-1J Sky Raiders roared above the treetops, strafing enemy positions around the bunker. Their attacks kept the North Vietnamese from closing in again and gave cover to the breakout. The men inside finally slipped from the shattered structure and began moving toward the Old Lang Vei under protection of the airstrikes. Overhead, forward air controllers guided Navy A-1J Sky Raiders down through the gaps in the heavy clouds. The pilots, called Super Spads, roared just above the treetops, strafing enemy positions around the bunker. Their attacks kept the North Vietnamese from closing in again and gave cover to the breakout. The men inside finally slipped from the sheltered structure and began moving toward the old Lang Vei under the protection of the airstrikes. During the retreat, James Moreland was wounded and left behind to die. At the old camp, a UH-1 helicopter sent for evacuation became a scene of chaos. As it landed, hundreds of Laotians swarmed the aircraft, desperate to escape. The crew fought to clear the skids so the helicopter could take off. Somehow, the overloaded Huey managed to lift clear, carrying wounded Americans and Special Forces soldiers. However, in this confusion, not everyone got out. First Lieutenant Thomas Todd was left behind in the rush. He hid until later when a Marine CH-46 helicopter pulled him out. Staff Sergeant Dennis Thompson, the communications sergeant, also survived the battle but missed the initial evacuation. Using his radio, he called for rescue, but when a helicopter tried to return, it failed to reach him. He was captured by the North Vietnamese and spent years as a prisoner before being released in 1973. When the fighting at Lang Vei ended, its small garrison had been destroyed as an effective force. All 27 Americans were declared casualties. 17 were wounded, 6 were dead or presumed dead, and 4 were taken prisoner. Among the indigenous troops, losses were difficult to record. Only 33 Mobile Strike Force strikers were officially listed as missing in action a month later, while records of the Bruce Civilian Irregular Defense Group were incomplete. Many deserted before or during the assault, leaving the defense weakened. The North Vietnamese also paid heavily. Airstrikes and artillery pounded the camp for 10 hours after its capture. Damaged tanks were towed away, but others were destroyed in place. The massive bombardment forced the North Vietnamese to pull back into Laos, carrying their dead and wounded. Although they overran the camp, the North Vietnamese failed to hold their ground at Lang Vei. However, neither did Americans. They never returned to reoccupy Lang Vei after its fall. The base was abandoned, destroyed, and never re-established by U.S. military forces. It remained just another harrowing chapter in the history of the Vietnam War. Thank you for watching this episode. Don't forget to like it and share the video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the Militology Channel for more. Stay tuned.